Snow came early that year, the kind that didn't announce itself with drama, but arrived quietly, laying its hand over the land like a vow. I remember how the fences disappeared first, how the road into Ashfall Ridge narrowed into a pale ribbon, and how silence settled so deep you could hear your own thoughts creak when you moved. Winter had a way of reminding men who they were when no one was looking, or who they had failed to be. I had just finished breaking ice from the trough when I heard the knock. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 measured taps, like someone asking permission from the world rather than demanding anything from it. I didn't expect company. Folks didn't wander out this far once the snow set in, not unless they were lost or desperate, and sometimes those two things wore the same face. When I opened the door, the cold rushed in first. Then she stood there, framed by drifting white and a sky the color of old tin. She was younger than I expected, wrapped in a coat that had seen better owners, her hair tucked beneath a wool hat pulled low. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, but her eyes were steady. Not hopeful, not afraid, just steady. "I heard you might need help," she said. Her voice was calm, though it carried the faint rasp of someone who hadn't spoken much lately. "I can work." Most people led with apologies or explanations. She didn't. She waited, hands folded in front of her, like she was prepared for whatever answer I chose to give. I felt the old hesitation rise up. The one Ashfall Ridge had taught me well. A lone woman asking for work in winter meant questions. It meant looks in town. It meant talk. And I had lived long enough learning how to keep my life small enough to avoid all that. "I don't hire easy," I said, more to test her than to refuse. "That's fine," she replied. "I don't stay easy either." Something in that made me step aside. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch, or the way the snow kept falling behind her like time itself was closing a door. I told myself it would be temporary, just until the next thaw. That's how lies usually start, small and reasonable. Her name was Marlowe Quinn. She didn't offer where she came from, and I didn't ask. We shook hands, her grip firm despite the cold, and I noticed how carefully she held herself, as if she had learned the cost of taking up too much space. I showed her the bunkhouse, the tools, the rhythm of the place. She listened the way a person listens when survival depends on remembering every word. Ashfall Ridge noticed her by sundown. Mrs. Calder at the boarding house raised an eyebrow when Marlowe passed through town for supplies. Sheriff Hollis Reed leaned a little heavier against the post outside his office when he saw her walk beside me, his eyes measuring, weighing. No one said anything outright, but winter carried whispers the way it carried smoke. Marlowe never reacted. She moved through town as if the looks were weather, unpleasant, unavoidable, not worth arguing with. Back at the ranch, she worked until her breath came out in white bursts, her hands raw and red, never once asking if she could stop. She learned the horses' temperaments faster than most men I'd hired, and when one of the younger colts spooked, she didn't yank the reins or raise her voice. She waited. So did the horse. That told me more about her than any story could have. Nights were quiet. We ate across from each other at the small table, the lamp throwing soft shadows against the walls. She ate slowly, like someone used to making food last, and always cleaned her plate without a word. Sometimes I caught her looking at the fire a little too long, as if it held a memory she hadn't decided what to do with yet. I didn't ask. Some truths don't need chasing. The storm came hard one evening, wind screaming through the gaps in the barn boards, snow driving sideways like it had somewhere urgent to be. One of the gates had come loose, and we found ourselves trapped inside with the horses while the world outside disappeared. The lantern flickered, casting light that made everything feel smaller, closer. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from fear but from cold, and I handed her my coat without thinking. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing mine just briefly. The moment lingered longer than it should have, stretched thin by the sound of wind and the quiet breathing of animals that trusted us to keep them alive. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. I nodded, because anything more would have felt like too much. When the storm passed, the ranch felt different. Not warmer, just less empty. In town, the looks sharpened. Mrs. Calder's voice grew louder. Sheriff Reed stopped me one afternoon and reminded me, politely, that Ashfall Ridge had its ways. I listened. I always listened. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't immediately bend. Marlo noticed that too. She didn't smile. She just worked a little harder, like she understood the cost of being allowed to stay. The snow kept falling, and somewhere between the chores and the quiet meals, something settled into place. Not love. Not yet. Just a shared understanding that winter was easier when someone else knew how cold it could get. When I lay awake at night, listening to the wind scrape along the walls, I realized the knock at my door hadn't just brought her into my life. It had woken something I'd buried deep enough to survive. And winter, patient as it was, wasn't finished asking what I planned to do about it. Winter does its truest work after people think they have learned its shape. The days grew brighter, but no warmer, the snow crusting over like a wound that pretends it has healed. I began to notice things about Marlo without meaning to. The way she folded her gloves each night, as if order itself were a promise. The way she paused before entering a room, as though listening for permission no one ever gave her. She spoke little, yet nothing about her felt empty. I learned pieces of her the way one learns a landscape, by walking it slowly. A scar along her wrist she covered without thinking. A letter she kept tucked inside her coat, folded so many times it had grown soft as cloth. I never read it. I didn't need to. Some losses announced themselves without words. Town pressure tightened like a cinched strap. Sheriff Reed rode out one afternoon, his horse steaming in the cold, his tone courteous but firm. He talked about propriety, about rumors, about how winter made people restless and careless. I understood the warning beneath the civility. Ashfall Ridge didn't forgive deviations easily, especially not quiet ones that refused to explain themselves. That night, Marlo packed her few belongings without announcing it. I found her at the bunkhouse, her movements careful, precise, like she wanted to leave no trace behind. She told me she'd be gone by morning, not because she wanted to, because staying had begun to cost too much. I surprised us both by asking her to wait. The storm came before dawn, sudden and vicious, the kind that erased landmarks and certainty in the same breath. A section of fence collapsed, sending the horses into panic, and instinct took over where thought failed. We moved together without instruction, bodies angled into the wind, trust forming in the narrow space between disaster and survival. At one point, she slipped on the ice, and I caught her, the force of it knocking the breath from us both. She laughed then, sharp and brief, a sound like something breaking free. We got the animals secured just as the storm reached its peak. Inside the barn, soaked and shaking, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. I saw then not fragility, but exhaustion, the kind earned by carrying oneself alone for too long. I realized how easily I could lose her by choosing comfort over courage. When the storm passed, the world stood hushed, reshaped. Sheriff Reed returned that afternoon, and this time I spoke before he could. I didn't argue or plead. I told him she worked here, that she belonged here as much as the land did now, and that I would answer for that choice. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement. Marlo didn't say thank you. She just stayed. Spring came reluctantly, melting the snow in thin, shining veins. The town softened, if only slightly. People adjusted, as they always do, to truths that refused to leave. Marlo and I never named what grew between us. We didn't have to. It lived in shared silences, in the way she reached for the coffee pot before I did, in the way I fixed the latch she always struggled with, without being asked. One evening, as the last snow finally gave up its hold, she stood beside me watching the horizon bleed gold into blue. She slipped her hand into mine, not as a question, but as a continuation of something already decided. I squeezed once. That was enough. If you've listened this far, maybe you know what winter asks of us. It asks who we will shelter, and who we are willing to become when the cold presses in. Some stories don't end with noise or spectacle. Some end with warmth earned quietly, honestly. If this one stayed with you, if it warmed something you thought had gone numb, then stay a little longer. Subscribe, and walk with me into the next story.